Every road you've driven on, every bridge you've crossed, every dam holding back millions of tons of water. None of it exists without one thing: cement. And for most of the 20th century, one company made more of it than anyone else on Earth. They mixed the powder that held America together. The highways, the dams, the foundations of a nation building itself faster than anyone thought possible. Their name was Lehigh. You've probably never heard of them. At their peak, Lehigh ran 21 plants across 10 states. They set a world production record in 1924. They supplied the concrete under the Golden Gate Bridge. They powered the Interstate Highway System, the largest public works project in human history. Then it all fell apart. No explosion, no scandal, no single villain. So how does the company that literally built America end up forgotten by it? And why does nobody talk about it? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Men Who Saw Gold in Limestone. America didn't wait for the Civil War to end its aftermath. It moved. Railroads pushed west. Cities rose faster than they could be mapped. Bridges crossed rivers that once defined the country. Skyscrapers climbed higher every year. Everything was being built at a speed no nation had ever seen. But there was one problem. None of it could stand without cement. And America didn't really make its own. The strongest cement in the world, Portland cement, still came from England and Germany. Shipped across the Atlantic in barrels, often not even for profit, but as ballast to stabilize ships. Europe wasn't maximizing value. And America, the fastest growing nation on Earth, was building its future with someone else's material. That imbalance couldn't last. It began along the Lehigh River in Pennsylvania. A man named David O. Saylor was born there in 1827. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an engineer. He was a businessman. In 1866, he founded the Coplace Cement Company, producing natural cement, the standard material of the time. It worked. It sold. It built cities. But Saylor saw something beyond it. Portland cement, stronger, denser, more reliable, had already become the global standard in England. He wanted to make it in America. The question was whether American stone could do the same thing. He brought in a chemist from Lehigh University, John N. Eckert. What they found changed everything. The limestone along the Lehigh River already contained the key ingredients: lime, silica, alumina, not refined, not engineered, just naturally there in the right balance. It was as if the earth had already prepared the formula. Saylor hadn't discovered something new. He realized he had been standing on it all along. In 1871, he succeeded. He received the first American patent for Portland cement. By 1876, Coplace Cement won gold at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. By 1878, production had scaled into industry. American cement was no longer experimental. It was real. Saylor died in 1884. But what he proved spread across the Lehigh Valley. Then came Harry Clay Trexler. Born in 1854 in Allentown, he grew up inside America's industrial expansion. His business was lumber. But by the 1890s, he saw the shift. America wasn't just building anymore. It was building infrastructure. Every city needed foundations. Every road needed a base. Every bridge needed something stronger than wood. In 1897, Trexler co-founded the Lehigh Portland Cement Company with $250,000 in capital. A lumberman investing in stone looked strange. But Trexler wasn't thinking in materials. He was thinking in systems. Cement wasn't just a product. It was the base layer of a growing nation. And the Lehigh Valley had one of the richest limestone deposits in America. Trexler saw more than a rock. He saw inevitability. And from a quiet riverbank in Pennsylvania, a material that would help build a nation was about to define an entire era. Chapter 2. Why this valley mattered. Most people think cement is simple. Gray powder, mix it with water, it hardens. But the difference between good cement and bad cement is the difference between a bridge that lasts a century and one that fails in decades. And that difference shaped where American industry would concentrate. Before Portland cement, builders used natural cement made from impure limestone fired at lower temperatures. It was cheap, easy to produce, but unpredictable. One batch could hold, the next could fail without warning. Then came Portland cement, invented in 1824 by an English bricklayer, Joseph Aspdin. It changed construction forever. The process was simple in theory, but extreme in execution. Limestone and clay were heated to about 1,450 degrees Celsius, hot enough to partially melt the materials. At that temperature, something fundamental happens. The raw ingredients chemically bond into a new substance called clinker. That clinker is then cooled, ground into powder, and mixed with a small amount of gypsum to control how fast it sets. The result is a material that is strong, stable, and predictable. But only if the chemistry is right, and that's the real problem. To make Portland cement properly, you need very specific proportions of lime, silica, and alumina. Most regions in the United States didn't have that balance in one place. So manufacturers had to combine materials from different sources. Limestone from one region, clay from another, sometimes even industrial byproducts. Carefully adjusting ratios just to get acceptable quality. It was complex, expensive, and inconsistent. The Lehigh Valley was different. Its limestone already contained the right mineral balance naturally formed over millions of years of geology. Not perfect in a laboratory sense, but close enough that very little adjustment was needed. That single fact changed everything. But geology alone didn't create dominance. The valley had infrastructure aligned with it. The Lehigh River provided water and early industrial power. The Lehigh Valley Railroad connected quarries to coal fields and major East Coast cities. That meant three critical things were already solved. Raw material in, fuel in, finished product out. No extra complexity, no expensive logistics workarounds, just flow. By the late 1800s, the effect was massive. The Lehigh Valley became the center of American Portland cement production, supplying more than half of the entire country's output for decades. One region, one industry, national scale. But that dominance was about to be reinforced by something even more important than geology: technology. Early cement plants used vertical shaft kilns, tall structures where raw material was loaded from the top and removed from the bottom. They worked, but they were inefficient. Heat distribution was uneven, production stopped frequently, and scaling was limited. Then came a breakthrough. In 1889, at Coplay in the Lehigh Valley, the rotary kiln was introduced commercially in the United States. A rotary kiln is a long steel cylinder, slightly tilted, rotating continuously. Raw material enters one end and slowly moves through controlled heat zones until it exits as clinker. No stopping, no batch cycles, no uneven firing, just continuous chemical transformation. For the first time, cement production became fully industrial. Stable, repeatable, scalable. That innovation locked in the Lehigh Valley's advantage. Other regions could copy the chemistry. They could build plants, they could invest capital. But they were always playing catch-up on process efficiency and material consistency. For decades, the Lehigh Valley remained the most important cement-producing region in the United States. Not because it grew faster than others, but because it started with better geology and moved into industrial-scale production earlier than anyone else. A natural advantage, reinforced by engineering, turned into a century-long dominance. And for a long time, no one questioned it. Chapter 3. Follow the market. One plant. That's where Lehigh started. Ormrod, Pennsylvania, 1897. A single mill. 11 stockholders. $250,000. And a bet that America was about to need more cement than it had ever needed before. They were right. Within a few years, Lehigh added a second plant at West Coplay, then a third, back in Ormrod. The Pennsylvania operation was humming. Orders were coming in. Business was good. Then they ran into a wall. Cement is heavy, dense, expensive to move. You can't just pile it on a train and ship it across the country without eating your entire profit margin on freight costs. Lehigh was already sending product as far west as Kansas City. And every barrel that traveled that far cost them more than it should have. The solution was obvious once you saw it. Don't ship the cement to the market. Build the plant at the market. In 1902, Lehigh broke ground in Mitchell, Indiana, closer to the Midwest, closer to the customers. The second Mitchell plant followed in 1906, bigger than the first. Then Fogelsville, Pennsylvania in 1907. Mason City, Iowa in 1911, their first factory west of the Mississippi. Medellin Falls, Washington in 1914, pushing all the way to the Pacific Northwest. 3 more plants acquired in Newcastle, Pennsylvania the same year. Fordwick, Virginia in 1915. Oglesby, Illinois in 1916. Eola, Kansas in 1917. Plant by plant, state by state, following demand like water finding its level. Eola, Kansas tells the whole story of what these plants meant. Not just to Lehigh, but to the towns that grew around them. The facility there started as the Iola Portland Cement Company, built in 1900 on 600 acres just south of town. At opening, it was called the largest cement plant in the world. Capacity of 3,000 barrels a day. Nearly 900 workers at peak employment, the single largest employer in all of Allen County. And it wasn't just a factory, it was a world. The company built housing for workers on site, a school, a store, a church. Everything a person needed to live was provided and quietly deducted from their paycheck. Workers didn't just work for Lehigh. In many ways, they lived inside Lehigh. When Lehigh Portland Cement bought the plant in 1917 for $79,500 plus $400,000 in assumed debt, they inherited not just machinery, but an entire community built around that machinery. For the next 5 decades, Lehigh remained the largest employer in the county. That relationship, company and town, inseparable, would matter enormously later. When one went down, so did the other. By 1920, Lehigh was the biggest cement company in America by number of plants. Over 12 million barrels of Portland cement produced annually. Not the biggest revenue, not the flashiest brand, just the most productive, most geographically spread operation in the industry. They kept buying. In 1923, one of the largest cement plants in the South opened in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1924, Lehigh set a world production record, 16.5 million barrels in a single year. No cement manufacturer anywhere on Earth had ever hit that number. Then came the acquisitions. 4 plants in 1925, Alson, New York, Union Bridge, Maryland, Bath and Sans Eddy, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York in 1927. By the time that deal closed, Lehigh operated 21 plants across 10 states. Net income in 1926 hit $5.9 million on revenues of $30.5 million. 21 plants, 10 states, 1 family. That's the part people miss when they study Lehigh. This wasn't a corporation run by rotating executives and quarterly earnings calls. For most of its independent life, it was a family business operating at industrial scale. Harry Trexler ran it from founding until 1926. Edward M. Young took over and held the chair until his death in 1932. His son Joseph stepped up immediately, leading Lehigh through the worst economic crisis in American history. Joseph's son William took the helm in 1964 and stayed until 1983. 4 generations, same family, 86 years. That continuity gave Lehigh stability. The same values, the same relationships, the same long-term thinking across decades. But stability and stubbornness look identical from the outside, until the world changes and one of them refuses to. Chapter 4. The Powder That Built a Nation. 2 things happened in America at the same time, and together they created a demand for cement so massive that no one had ever seen anything like it before. The first was reinforced concrete. Engineers figured out that concrete, which handles compression beautifully but cracks under tension, could be paired with steel rebar running through it. Steel handles the tension, concrete handles the compression. Together they form a structural material stronger than either one alone. Suddenly you could build bridges with longer spans, taller buildings, thicker dams. Things that previously required enormous amounts of stone or steel could now be built faster, cheaper, and higher with reinforced concrete. The second was the automobile. In 1900, there were roughly 8,000 cars in the United States. By 1920, there were more than 8 million. In 20 years, 1,000 times more vehicles on roads that were never designed for them. Dirt tracks turned to mud in rain. Gravel washed away. The country needed paved roads, and paved roads meant cement. Every single mile of concrete road consumed between 3,000 and 5,000 barrels of Portland cement. America had hundreds of thousands of miles to pave. These 2 forces hit simultaneously, and the cement industry went vertical. The projects that followed were staggering. In the 1890s and early 1900s, New York City and Chicago ran massive underground infrastructure programs. Sewers, water mains, subway tunnels, consuming Portland cement at scales that would have seemed absurd a generation earlier. The new Croton Dam in New York, completed in 1906, was one of the largest concrete structures on Earth at the time. Then came the Panama Canal. Finished in 1914 after a decade of construction, it required concrete in quantities that pushed American manufacturers to their absolute limits. Locks, walls, spillways. The whole thing was essentially a cement project on a geographic scale. By the 1920s and 30s, the icons were stacking up fast. The Empire State Building rose in 1931. 102 floors of steel and concrete in Midtown Manhattan. The George Washington Bridge opened the same year, its towers anchored in massive concrete foundations. The Hoover Dam in 1936 used 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York. The The Golden Gate Bridge followed in 1937. Lehigh's California plant, the Permanente facility, opened in 1939, supplied cement directly into some of these projects. The Golden Gate Bridge, Shasta Dam, San Jose International Airport. The powder coming out of that plant was setting into structures that millions of people would use every single day without ever knowing where it came from. That's the thing about cement. When it works, nobody thinks about it. It just holds. Then the war came. When America entered World War I in 1917, cement suddenly had military applications nobody had planned for. Bunkers, ammunition depots, military rail lines, field hospitals. The Army needed concrete everywhere, fast. Lehigh answered. 451 Lehigh employees served in the war. Their names were engraved on a memorial plaque at the company's Allentown headquarters. Harry Trexler himself, the man who co-founded Lehigh, earned the rank of general in the National Guard, serving in the Quartermaster Corps through both the Spanish-American War and World War I. The company that made the material also sent the men. Then came the Depression, and after the Depression, the New Deal. Roosevelt's federal infrastructure programs were, from Lehigh's perspective, one of the greatest business events in the company's history. The Tennessee Valley Authority alone built 16 dams across 7 states. Federal road programs, public schools, bridges replacing wooden crossings that had stood since the 1800s. Every project needed cement. Lehigh was positioned to supply it. But there was a lesson embedded in all of this that nobody at Lehigh was paying enough attention to. When the federal government opened the spending tap, the cement industry boomed. When it tightened, during recessions, during political shifts, during periods of budget constraint, orders dried up almost immediately. Cement wasn't just a building material. It was a direct measure of public investment in America's physical future. And that dependence on government-driven demand would eventually become one of Lehigh's greatest vulnerabilities. For Chapter 5, Throw 8 Plants Overboard. The warning signs came before the crash. Nobody wanted to see them, but they were there. By the mid-1920s, the cement market was quietly plateauing. Not because the economy was bad, it wasn't. The economy was roaring. But the biggest cities had already been built. The major sewer systems were in the ground. The first wave of paved roads was done. The urgent, desperate need that had driven cement demand for 20 years was starting to ease. In 1926, Lehigh posted net income of $5.9 million on revenues of $30.5 million. Solid numbers, respectable margins. The kind of year that makes a board of directors feel comfortable. Then 1929 arrived. Before the stock market collapsed in October, before Black Tuesday, before anyone was using the word depression, Lehigh's revenues had already fallen to $19.3 million. Net income had dropped to $2.7 million. The market hadn't even crashed yet, and Lehigh had already lost more than half its profitability. That's not a recession. That's a saturated market running out of road. Then Wall Street went down, and everything got much, much worse. Capacity utilization, the percentage of production capability actually being used, fell from 72% in 1928 to 46% in 1931. Almost half the kilns in America were sitting cold. Prices collapsed with them. Portland cement had peaked at $2.02 per barrel in 1930. By 1931, it had fallen to $1.15, a 43% price drop in 12 months. Manufacturers were selling below cost just to keep some cash moving. The entire American cement industry lost $25 million in 1931. Combined, the whole sector in the red in a single year. Lehigh, still the second largest producer in the country, held on through 1931. Barely profitable, hanging by its fingernails. Then 1932 hit and the losses came. Nearly $2 million in the red in 1932. Another $592,000 lost in 1933. Revenues that had once topped $30 million shrank to just $9 million in 1935. 70% gone. In less than a decade, one of the most powerful industrial companies in America had watched its business fall apart in slow motion. Joseph S. Young took over as president in 1932, inheriting the worst possible moment in the company's history. His father, Edward, had just died. The Depression was deepening, and Lehigh was hemorrhaging money with no end in sight. Young made a decision that must have felt like cutting off his own arm. He closed 8 plants. Both facilities in Ormrod, Pennsylvania, the original birthplace of Lehigh, the ground where it all started in 1897, went dark. West Copley, gone. Bath, gone. All 3 plants in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, shuttered simultaneously. One of the 2 Mitchell, Indiana facilities, closed. 8 plants. Thousands of workers let go. Decades of investment abandoned. Years later, Young told a reporter exactly how he thought about it. The only way to survive the storm, he said, was to throw the weakest plants overboard. Keep the efficient ones running. Concentrate everything on the operations that could actually compete. It worked. Painfully, slowly, it worked. But the numbers don't tell the full story. They never do. Ormrod, Pennsylvania was more than a factory. It was a town built around a factory. When Lehigh shut both plants there, the reason for Ormrod to exist disappeared with them. Residents left, businesses closed. The community that had grown up feeding, housing, and serving Lehigh workers had nothing left to feed, house, or serve. Ormrod effectively ceased to exist as a functioning community. West Copley, a small village along the Lehigh River, lost its largest employer overnight. Newcastle lost 3 at once. These weren't just economic setbacks. They were the erasure of the social fabric that industrial employment had quietly been holding together for 30 years. Nobody planned for that. Nobody had a transition program. Nobody was asking what happened to the town when the company left. The company survived. The towns did not. By 1940, Lehigh had stabilized. Revenues sat at $16.9 million. Net income, $2 million. Modest, careful. Nothing like the peak years, but positive, alive. Remaining production capacity, 22 million barrels per year. Still more than 8% of total U.S. capacity. From 21 plants down to a lean, focused operation built around the survivors. The most important of those survivors was Union Bridge, Maryland. A single facility that Lehigh would spend the next 2 decades pouring investment into. Tripling its capacity, modernizing its kilns, making it the undisputed core of everything Lehigh still was. They had made it through. Bloodied, smaller, but still standing. The question was whether the lessons of the Depression would stick, or whether, in the good years ahead, Lehigh would forget what it had just learned about the cost of carrying too much weight. Chapter 6. The Golden Years That Were Hiding a Rot. The war ended in 1945. 16 million American soldiers came home. They were young. They were alive. And they wanted a life. The federal government handed them one. The GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, offered low-interest loans for homes, education, and businesses. Millions of veterans took the housing option. They moved out of cities. They moved to the edges. They moved to places that had been farmland 6 months earlier and would be neighborhoods 6 months later. Levittown, New York appeared in 1947. 17,000 homes built on Long Island potato fields in under 2 years. Levittown, Pennsylvania followed in 1951. Another 17,000 houses rising from empty ground. Identical, fast, concrete foundations poured by the hundreds every single week. This was happening everywhere, not just in Levittown. Across the entire country, in every state, in every county where a returning veteran could afford a plot of land and a mortgage payment. Between 1945 and 1960, per capita income in America rose 20% in real terms. People were buying cars, buying houses, building lives that required roads to drive on, foundations to stand on, and bridges to cross. The raw material hunger was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. For Lehigh, the Depression must have felt like a bad dream. Because this was the morning after. Then Eisenhower signed the bill that changed everything. June 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act, the largest public works project in the history of the human race. The goal was a 41,000-mile network of interstate highways connecting all 48 states. Eisenhower had 2 reasons. The first was commerce. The country needed faster, safer roads for goods and people. The second was military. He had seen Germany's Autobahn after World War II and understood what a connected highway network meant for moving troops and equipment in an emergency. He had also never forgotten a 1919 military convoy he participated in that took 62 days to cross the United States. On roads so bad the vehicles kept breaking down. The price tag was originally estimated at $25 billion. It eventually cost $129 billion. The federal government covered 90%, funded through gasoline taxes. States paid the remaining 10%. The scale of materials required was almost incomprehensible. Every single $1 billion spent on construction consumed 16 million barrels of cement, alongside more than 500,000 tons of steel, 18 million pounds of explosives, and 76 million tons of aggregate. When it was all finished, 48 million tons of cement had been poured into the Interstate Highway System, roughly 40% of everything American manufacturers produced in an entire year. Lehigh's plants in Maryland, Indiana, Iowa, and New York were positioned exactly where the work was heaviest. Orders flowed in directly. The kilns ran hot around the clock. In 1956, the same year Eisenhower signed the Highway Act, Lehigh posted its highest profit in company history, $13.1 million. In 1959, revenues hit $100.6 million with net income of $12.1 million. Those were the best numbers Lehigh would ever post as an independent American company. They would never be matched again. Riding the boom, Lehigh pushed south. Florida was exploding. Retirees, sun-seekers, young families, all pouring into a state that barely had infrastructure to support them. Lehigh built plants in Miami and Bunnell, Florida during the 1950s to capture that market directly. Back in Maryland, they made their biggest single investment. In 1955, Lehigh poured $15 million into Union Bridge, tripling the plant's capacity to 3 million barrels per year. By 1960, Lehigh's total production capacity had crossed 31 million barrels annually, bigger than the Depression years, bigger than the peak years of World War II. The company that had once thrown 8 plants overboard to survive was now running harder than ever. But inside the boardroom, something else was happening. The executives knew the numbers weren't as clean as they looked. Joseph Young and the senior leadership were quietly telling anyone who would listen that Lehigh's earnings were overstated, not fraudulently, structurally. The enormous cost of maintaining aging equipment was being carried in the capital investment account, treated as an asset rather than an expense, which meant the profit figures on paper were higher than the actual economic reality. In plain terms, the books looked good, because the true cost of keeping old kilns running wasn't being counted honestly. And the kilns were old. Some of them dated back to the early 1900s. They worked, but they burned far more fuel per ton of output than modern designs. They were slower, less efficient, less competitive against newer facilities being built by rivals with fresh capital. Lehigh had the revenue to fix this. The late 1950s were the time to act. Reinvest aggressively, replace the aging equipment, build the infrastructure for the next 50 years. They didn't. Not fully. Not decisively. They modernized Union Bridge. They built the Florida plants. But a comprehensive, company-wide commitment to replacing the old kilns before they became a crisis, that never happened. The golden years felt too good. The orders kept coming. The profits kept posting. Nobody wanted to spend the boom years preparing for what came after the boom. They would spend the next 20 years paying for that choice. Chapter 7. The Long Way Down. The 1960s looked fine on the surface. Orders were still coming in. The Interstate Highway System was mid-construction. American cities were still growing. If you walked through Lehigh's offices in Allentown and looked at the revenue numbers, you could convince yourself everything was under control. It wasn't. Underneath those numbers, a slow collapse was already in motion. And the decisions being made, or deliberately not being made, were locking in the outcome years before anyone in that building was willing to say it out loud. The factories were old. That was the core of it. Most of Lehigh's plants had been running for 50, 60, sometimes nearly 70 years. The kilns were small by modern standards, inefficient. They burned through fuel at rates that newer facilities couldn't match. Maintenance costs climbed every year on equipment engineered in the early 1900s for a world that no longer existed. Leadership faced a clear choice. Invest heavily. Modernize the old plants, replace the kilns, spend what was necessary to stay competitive. Or close the plants that couldn't justify the investment and concentrate everything on the ones that could. They chose to close. St. Eddy, Pennsylvania went dark in 1962. Oglesby, Illinois in 1963. The Beanal, Florida plant, using coquina shells as raw material, never a truly economical process, closed in 1965. Fordwick, Virginia in 1968. Then 1971 arrived, and the pace accelerated. Birmingham, Alabama, gone. Fogelsville, Pennsylvania, gone. Buffalo, New York, sold. Iola, Kansas, the largest employer in Allen County for 50 straight years, shut its gates for the last time. From 21 plants across 10 states at the 1927 peak to just 6 remaining facilities. 1 each in Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, New York, and Washington. 21-6 in 44 years. And instead of replacing what was lost with something stronger, Lehigh was simply becoming a smaller version of itself. That is not the same as becoming leaner. It's just shrinking. While the closures played out, a separate problem was building in Washington. During the 1960s, Lehigh had been acquiring ready-mix concrete companies across Virginia and Kentucky. The logic seemed sound. Move closer to the customer, capture more of the value chain. The Federal Trade Commission saw it differently. In 1972, the FTC ordered Lehigh to divest 17 concrete plants across both states on antitrust grounds. Lehigh sold 11 Virginia facilities to Florida Rock Industries for $13 million in cash, then used that money to repurchase its own stock at prices below book value. Think about what that signals. When a company buys its own shares for less than its assets are worth, it isn't investing in growth. It's admitting it can't find anything better to do with the capital. The 6 remaining Kentucky plants were sold in 1974 to complete the divestiture. 2 years of legal battles, millions in costs, a forced exit from a business built over a decade. Nothing gained. Then came the carpets. In 1968, Lehigh made 2 acquisitions that had nothing to do with cement: a bedroom furniture manufacturer in Florida, a carpet, rug, and yarn producer in Georgia. The thinking was diversification. Smooth out the cyclical swings of construction with consumer goods. It failed completely. Neither business found its footing. By 1976, Lehigh sold the Georgia carpet operation back to its own executives. A quiet admission the experiment had been a mistake from day one. A cement company had spent years trying to figure out how to sell rugs. Meanwhile, the kilns generating its actual revenue were aging without adequate reinvestment. The distraction had a real cost, not just in money. In attention, the one thing no acquisition can replace. In October 1973, OPEC cut oil production by 5%. Within months, crude oil prices had doubled. For cement manufacturers, it was a direct strike at the operating core. Rotary kilns run on sustained industrial heat. Every ton of clinker requires burning hundreds of liters of fuel. Energy isn't a secondary input. It's the central one. When fuel costs double, margins don't compress. They collapse. Lehigh's aging kilns were already burning more fuel per ton than competitors running modern equipment. The energy crisis didn't create that gap. It just made it impossible to ignore. Research from this period confirms that total factor productivity across the entire American cement industry had been falling steadily through the 1960s and 70s. The industry had stopped innovating. Technology reinvestment had been deferred year after year. Lehigh was not the exception. It was the example. By 1976, the final full year of independent operation, Lehigh posted revenues of $119.5 million. Net income, $6.1 million. A profit margin of 5.1%. On a company that size, with that volume of aging infrastructure, 5 cents on every dollar left, nothing for transformation. Just enough to keep the lights on. Just enough to tell shareholders the business was technically still alive. 80 years of American industrial history. 5 cents on the dollar. Something had to give. Chapter 8, sold for a rock-bottom price. In 1977, a German company bought Lehigh Portland Cement for $85 million in cash. The people involved, on both sides of the table, later described that number as a rock-bottom price. Not a polite way of saying the seller could have negotiated harder. A genuine acknowledgement that one of the most consequential industrial companies in American history had changed hands for far less than it was worth at its peak. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It was exactly what Lehigh was worth in 1977. The kilns were old. Many had been running for 50 years or more. Small by modern standards. burning fuel at rates no competitive manufacturer could justify. The company that once set world production records was now a collection of aging assets with thin margins, a shrinking footprint, and no credible plan for what came next. Portland Zementwerke, Heidelberg. AG, a unit of Heidelberger Zement AG out of Germany, looked past all of that. They weren't buying the Lehigh of 1977. They were buying what was underneath it: the limestone deposits, the distribution network built over 80 years, the customer relationships that survived every contraction, infrastructure that, with serious investment and serious management, could be rebuilt entirely. They were right. But what it cost American industrial identity in the process is more complicated than a simple turnaround story. In 1961, every single cement plant in the United States was owned by an American company, 100% domestic. By 1990, roughly 70% of American cement production capacity was controlled by foreign owners, predominantly European. Lehigh wasn't just one deal among many. It was one of the earliest and most prominent. What looked like a single business transaction in 1977 was actually the opening move in a systematic foreign takeover of an entire American industry. The name Lehigh was kept. Headquarters stayed in Allentown. On the surface, not much appeared to change. But the ownership had crossed the Atlantic. And with ownership goes decision-making, capital allocation, and ultimately identity. What the Germans brought was a word American management had been avoiding for years: discipline. Heidelberger Zement's CEO, Peter Schumacher, operated on a philosophy that was equal parts simple and ruthless. Not just market leadership, cost leadership. If you couldn't be the lowest cost producer in your region, you had no defensible future. Within 3 years of the acquisition, engineers from Heidelberg's flagship plant in Lehmann, Germany, had cut energy consumption across Lehigh facilities by 23%. Simultaneously, production capacity increased by 17%. The kilns that American management had run inefficiently for decades were suddenly operating at a fundamentally different standard. Through the 1980s, the modernization continued. Full automation of production stages that had previously required manual oversight every shift. Heavy haul trucks with 80-ton capacity replaced fleets of smaller quarrying vehicles. Alternative fuels, used tires, industrial waste, were fed into the kilns alongside traditional coal. At the temperatures inside a rotary kiln, those materials combust completely. No toxic emissions, just heat, efficiently extracted from material that would otherwise go to landfill. The turnaround was real, measurable, and swift. Heidelberg hadn't just bought a cement company, they had fixed one. In 3 years, after American management had spent 2 decades watching the same operation deteriorate. That contrast deserves a moment. In 1980, Lehigh acquired the Universal Atlas Cement Division from U.S. Steel Corporation for substantially more than $100 million. Universal Atlas was no minor player. Founded in 1889, with annual revenues between $120 and $150 million, a company with history nearly as deep as Lehigh's own. Combined, they controlled 7% of the entire U.S. cement market, second in the nation behind only Lone Star Industries. The Federal Trade Commission responded immediately. Lehigh was ordered to sell the Universal Atlas plant in Hannibal, Missouri, plus 3 distribution terminals on antitrust grounds. For the next 10 years, acquiring any cement facility in 5 Midwestern states required prior FTC approval. The enforcement cost real assets and real flexibility. But the core of the deal held. Second largest cement producer in America, a position that would have been unimaginable just 3 years earlier when the company was sold at rock bottom. The 1980s ran a strange paradox, buying and shrinking simultaneously. In 1982, Lehigh purchased the Cementune, New York plant for $11.6 million and acquired a York, Pennsylvania facility from Medusa Cement Corp. By end of 1985, 9 plants across 9 states. Then, the selling resumed. Medellin Falls, Washington, Lehigh's Pacific Northwest foothold since 1914, was sold to French-owned Lafarge Corporation in 1989. 75 years of presence on the West Coast ended with a transaction. Cementune, bought in 1982, closed in 1993. 11 years gone. A joint venture with Centex Corporation at Waco, Texas, in 1986 for specialty cement. One of the few genuinely forward-looking moves in an otherwise defensive decade. Then 1995 changed everything overnight. Heidelberger Cement transferred the entire North American operations of Cementeries CBRSA, a Belgian affiliate, under Lehigh's umbrella. CBR had acquired Genstar Corporation's complete West Coast cement business in 1986 for $327.5 million. Plants in Redding and Tehachapi, California. Facilities in Edmonton, Alberta. The merger quadrupled Lehigh's revenues in a single move. A company sitting at 8th place in U.S. production jumped to 3rd in North America before the year ended. Not through organic growth, not through building, through a European conglomerate consolidating assets under a brand name that still said Lehigh on the door, while every meaningful decision was being made in Heidelberg. The name held. The identity was gone. Chapter 9. The towns that disappeared when the plants did. The history books remember companies, revenue figures, acquisition prices, market share percentages. They don't remember the towns. They don't remember the grocery stores that closed because the workers who shopped there were gone. The churches that went quiet because the families who filled the pews had moved away. The schools that shrank year after year because there were no children left to teach. That's what this chapter is about, not the balance sheet. The people behind it. A cement plant in early 20th century America wasn't just a factory. It was an ecosystem built around a single employer. In Iola, Kansas, the plant employed nearly 900 workers at its peak, the largest employer in all of Allen County for 50 consecutive years. The company built worker housing on site. A school, a store, a church. Workers didn't just work for Lehigh. They lived inside a world Lehigh had built around them, with costs quietly deducted from their paychecks every week. For half a century, life in Allen County ran through that plant one way or another. Then 1971 arrived, and it ended. When Lehigh shut Iola, the machinery was auctioned piece by piece. Some buildings were sold to Allen County for storage. The limestone quarry slowly filled with groundwater and became a lake. Today it's leased to the local Elks Lodge as a recreational area. A quarry that once fed millions of barrels of cement production is now where people go fishing on weekends. That's what happens when industry leaves and a community has to figure out what's next without a roadmap or a plan. Ormrod, Pennsylvania tells an even starker version. The town where Lehigh was born in 1897, where the first plant went up, where the whole empire started. Lost both factories during the Great Depression. Without those plants, there was no reason for Ormrod to exist. Residents left, Businesses closed. The community dissolved quietly and without ceremony. The place where it all began became one of the first casualties. Through the 1970s, Lehigh Valley itself was collapsing at a regional scale. Mack Trucks shuttered manufacturing. Bethlehem Steel, once one of the largest steel corporations on Earth, the company that supplied metal for the Golden Gate Bridge and armed 2 world wars, entered its long terminal decline and filed for bankruptcy in 2001. In 1982, Billy Joel released Allentown. The opening line was plain and devastating. "We're living here in Allentown, and they're closing all the factories down." It became the unofficial anthem of American deindustrialization, not just for Allentown, for every city that watched its industrial base dissolve in a single generation. Don Cunningham, who served as mayor of nearby Bethlehem during the worst of it, and later became CEO of the Lehigh Valley Economic Development Corporation, said it plainly. That Billy Joel's song haunts us to this day. The blast furnaces of Bethlehem Steel still stand. Concert backdrops now, film locations. What was once the loudest, hottest industrial site in the region is now scenery. The factory as aesthetic object, that's what's left when the work is gone. Then there's the environmental debt nobody budgeted for. Lehigh's Permanente plant in the hills above Los Altos, California, opened in 1939 and ran for over 80 years. Its concrete went into the Golden Gate Bridge, Shasta Dam, and San Jose International Airport. Generations of workers built careers there. The plant also accumulated violations across decades. Selenium, mercury, and nickel discharged into ponds. Endangered frogs relocated without permits. A 2022 county report cataloged 10 years of environmental breaches. After a major mechanical failure in 2020 shut down the kilns, the plant never restarted. In August 2023, Lehigh, by then Heidelberg Materials, signed a legally binding agreement surrendering its right to ever operate a cement kiln on that property again. Estimated site restoration cost, $60 to $100 million. The company covers some. Local government and taxpayers absorb the rest. That bill is the other side of 80 years of production. The side that never appeared in any annual report. The workers who built their lives around these plants had nothing waiting when the gates closed. Through the 1950s and 60s, a Lehigh job meant stability, union protection, a family wage, work you could pass to your son. Men spent 30, 40 years at the same facility until the job was part of who they were. When the plants closed, that world simply stopped existing. No retraining programs, no transition support, just a final paycheck and a locked gate. Their children, the generation that came of age in the 1970s and 80s expecting those jobs to be there, found nothing. Some left for cities. Some stayed and found less. Grocery stores closed. Bars went dark. Churches held smaller congregations every year. The domino effect of a plant closure doesn't appear in financial statements. It shows up in census data 20 years later. Population decline. Rising poverty rates. Empty storefronts on a main street that used to be alive on a Friday night. What's left now is fragments. The Sailor Park Kilns in Coplay, Pennsylvania, built 1893, shut 1904, stand as an open-air museum. 9 vertical kilns slowly deteriorating because maintenance funding is never enough. On the National Register of Historic Places, also fenced off because they're becoming structurally unsafe. In Northampton, the Atlas Cement Company Memorial Museum holds what it can, the only cement industry museum in the United States. In Iola, Kansas, The former plant grounds are now the Lehigh-Portland Trails, 14 miles of paths through what was once heavy industrial land. People hike there, sit by the lake, watch the water. It's genuinely peaceful. But it's also very quiet. And quietness was never what those grounds were built for. Chapter 10. What the Concrete Remembers. From 6 men with $250,000 to a footnote inside a German multinational. In one lifetime's worth of decades. 5 lessons. Real ones. Not the kind that belong on a motivational poster. Geographic advantage doesn't last forever. Lehigh won because the limestone in their valley was uniquely suited for Portland cement. Naturally, geologically, without any extra work. That edge held for a century. But when blending and grinding technology improved across the industry, other regions could replicate what Lehigh Valley did naturally. By 1970, the Los Angeles area had overtaken Lehigh Valley as the largest cement-producing region in the country. 100 years of dominance ended by better equipment somewhere else. Physical advantages need to be reinforced by process and innovation. Lehigh understood that too late. Equipment ages. So do companies that don't reinvest. 50-year-old kilns cannot compete with modern ones on fuel efficiency or output capacity. Lehigh's own executives acknowledged this problem out loud in the 1950s, during the most profitable years in company history, when they had the capital to act. They didn't. Not comprehensively. Partial modernization buys time. It doesn't buy survival. Public policy is a market. Lehigh rose with the New Deal. Hit its absolute peak with the Federal Highway Act of 1956. Began its decline when federal infrastructure investment contracted through the 1970s. For any company whose revenue depends on construction, government spending cycles aren't background noise. They are the signal. Missing that signal consistently is not bad luck. It's a strategic failure. Diversification without logic is just expensive distraction. Georgia carpets, Florida bedroom furniture, Virginia ready-mix concrete in markets they didn't control. None of it connected to what Lehigh actually knew how to do. They chased adjacent opportunities, while the core operation that generated everything went without adequate reinvestment. That trade never works. Not once. Not anywhere. When a factory closes, a community dies. Ormrod, Eola, West Co-Play. Every closure Lehigh executed was an economic decision with a human cost the company never fully accounted for. Workers with no retraining programs. Children who came of age in the 1970s expecting those jobs to exist and found locked gates instead. Grocery stores, churches, schools. The entire social infrastructure that industrial employment quietly held together, gone with the payroll. Closing a plant is a business decision. What happens to the town afterward is a moral one. And Lehigh, like most companies of its era, never treated it as such. Here's what hasn't disappeared. The concrete Lehigh made is still holding. The Golden Gate Bridge, Shasta Dam, thousands of miles of interstate highway, federal bridges carrying millions of vehicles every single day. Portland cement has a service life measured in centuries under proper conditions. The physical infrastructure Lehigh produced between 1900 and 1970 will outlast the company's name by generations. The backbone is still there, still carrying weight, still doing exactly what it was poured to do. Only the memory of who made it has been forgotten. Which brings us to right now. In 2026, America is debating new infrastructure legislation. Bridges built in the 1960s are reaching the end of their design lives. The domestic cement industry that once supplied everything this country needed is now predominantly foreign-owned. Import dependence for basic construction materials is a genuine policy conversation in Washington. The question worth sitting with is whether we're watching the early stages of another Lehigh cycle. Build it. Depend on it. Take it for granted. Stop investing in it. Then scramble when it's no longer there. Lehigh Portland Cement is not just the story of one company that rose and fell. It's the story of how a society treats the things that hold it together, right up until the moment those things are gone. And by then, it's always too late to remember their name.